guys, we're here with myself. I'm the founder and CEO of True Story, and we also have Lane from the Ethereum Foundation. And today we're going to be talking about a pretty big and important topic about Ethereum governance. And the whole spark of it was that Lane tweeted out something this weekend that went semi-viral where he said, Ethereum governance is on the brink of failing. And he went into a long Twitter thread talking about why he believed we're kind of stuck with Ethereum governance. And this is a topic I honestly care a lot about because I care a lot about the Ethereum community. I think the Ethereum community is one of the strongest communities in the crypto space. And I think it's really important that they figure out the governance situation for them to make progress in the future. And I was reading some of the comments in the Twitter thread, and I didn't really feel the discussion was really going anywhere. So I invited Lane to kind of come in and share his points of view in a more longer conversation rather than Twitter, where it's kind of hard to have a real conversation on Twitter. Twitter's more of a megaphone and not a roundtable discussion. But so I'm going to jump into the topic, and then I will ask Lane a bunch of questions, and we'll keep it conversational. And really, the point of today is really not to say that, like, yes, Ethereum governance is failing, or no, it's not failing. It's really to just get all sides on the table, to hear the arguments, to hear what's happening today, so that we can move forward and actually make progress and try to figure out what we're actually trying to solve for. And I'm going to share my screen real quick, and so that I can share Lane's tweet. Let's see. Okay, can people see that? No, okay, they can see me. Okay, can you see that, Lane?
Yep, okay. I can see it.
All right, so I'm going to read this. So you tweeted out that Ethereum governance has failed, and you're like, we're a de facto technocracy where a small group of technocrats, the core devs, have final say over what goes into the protocol. But the challenges we face today are increasingly non-technical. Core devs don't want to make these decisions because they feel unqualified. They fear legal liability. They're conflict avoidant and prefer just to write code. The Ethereum Foundation will not make these decisions in fears of taking sides. The Ethereum Foundation has also lost legitimacy for failing to deliver a new Ethereum.org website, for failing to pay its developers, and for failing to reply to grant applications and so forth. So then you laid out a few options that you think are left for the community to choose from. And option one, you said, give up on governance entirely and be like Bitcoin, where hard decisions will not get made, the protocol will not evolve, progress will slow, and other projects will eat Ethereum's lunch. Two, you said, replace technocracy with plutocracy. Ether holders would all be too happy to take control of decision making. Democracy is not even on the table as long as we don't have a formalized, unique identity. Option three, you said, would be to double down on the tyranny of structuralistness that we're in today. Give up on technocracy, enable capture by the elites, the well-connected, the already powerful. Four, you said, admit that decentralized governance just did not work and give up on Ethereum and find something better to work on. Or option five, we admit that decentralized governance does not work yet, but that we might someday figure it out. And so for now, we can fall back on centralized government for the time being and introduce more transparency, accountability, and better tools for having this kind of governance, and try our best to avoid capture. And then you concluded by saying that it's a rather unappetizing menu. If five is the best we can do for now, what's the point, right? What makes us think that decentralized governance will suddenly start working at some point in the future? What would that take realistically? What's our roadmap? And then you kind of said that in cases 1 through 4, you felt that maybe if we end up picking one of those options, we've kind of given up, and maybe we should admit that the Ethereum experiment has already failed. And then you left the discussion off by saying, what am I missing? And so I think, like, I'm going to stop sharing and just give my point of view on this before I let you run with it, Lane. I was following the Ethereum governance process for a while around last year when the parity bug happened. And I remember there was a lot of conflict during that time frame, and people were going forth on different EIP threads and different discussion forums about whether you should hard fork or not. And so for context, the parity bug happened in 2017, right?
Yeah, there were two issues. I believe one was November 2017. That's the one you're referring to.
Yeah. And then there was
and
a
then
lot
early 2018, I think, was the second one.
Yeah. And the one I'm referring to was when there were over $200 million of Ether locked in a wallet because of the hack. And people were arguing whether we should recover those funds or not. And there were really good arguments for either side. Some people who were against it were saying, like, okay, if we hard fork now, then the idea of immutability is just gone forever. Like the people were afraid that if we let this one time go, then like it's a slippery slope of how many exceptional cases we'll have for continuing to hard fork. And then the people on the other side of the spectrum felt that, this is the one-time situation. Let's just do it so that we can recover the funds and use the funds to improve the ecosystem, because it's $200 million that could be used towards the ecosystem. And people felt that, like, since this feels like an obvious non-contentious issue, meaning like it was an obvious hack, we can all agree that these funds shouldn't be missing and these innocent people shouldn't have $200 million missing from their wallets. And so there were arguments on both sides, and it was clear that people were very, very passionate about this issue, but there was no way to really come to a decision on this because both sides had really legitimate arguments. And I was looking at a lot of the discussions, and I kind of fundamentally came to the conclusion, and I could be wrong, I came to the conclusion that I felt the reason that there was a lack of ability to come to a conclusion is because the community lacked a set of social and political values that they can fall back on to make these decisions based off of. Like, for example, when you're building a company, there's a set of values and mission that you're going after, and every decision should be based on that mission. Does it serve that mission? And I felt like if the community and the project had a sense of mission and what they were really trying to solve for example, do they care about immutability or not? If they had that shared sense of values and mission, then maybe these kinds of decisions would get easier. And that's kind of where I left off last year in terms of my understanding of governance and what I felt like the community was missing. And I feel like I haven't caught up as much about what's happening in the community since then. So Lane, can you fill me in on sort of what's been happening in the Ethereum governance space since then? What's the current process for governance, if there is any? And let's start there.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that really helpful background there. Thanks for making time to chat today. I do think this is probably, or maybe definitely, the most important question in Ethereum at this moment, which is, what inspired my kind of like tweet rage storm a couple days ago. And, I also obviously feel that Ethereum is like the most important platform and initiative pretty much on the planet today. So I really can't imagine like a more interesting topic to talk about or a more important topic to talk about. So the sort of EIP 999 or funds recovery or parity wallet multi-sig, hack issue is like very, very complex and multifaceted. As you said, we could kind of spend like easily fill an hour, like, debating both sides of that. And I do think it's like very indicative in many ways and emblematic of a lot of the challenges we're facing and sort of the stresses that Ethereum's proto-governance, I would say, is undergoing. To answer your question, so it's Ethereum governance is like this weird primordial thing, which like has never really been clearly or strictly defined and is very, very informal, which I think is by design. And there's very specific reasons for that, right? We can kind of come back to that. The sort of formal process that we do have is we have this thing called the EIP process, right? So that's Ethereum Improvement Proposal process. And we have the all core devs. And that's what I was referring to when I talked about like a de facto technocracy, right? Because you can say Ethereum governance is informal or it doesn't have governance or whatever you want to say about it. But in reality, at the end of the day, I mean, it exhibits characteristics of all of, I think, like the 1 through 3, whatever I said. There's elements of plutocracy and there's elements of tyranny of structurelessness and there's elements of technocracy, et cetera. But really, at the end of the day, if you define Ethereum as the protocol, right, then like the core devs like sort of are in charge, with the caveat, of course, that people have veto. Yeah. Okay, so let's just walk through this very quickly, right? So the way that the protocol changes is anyone who has a GitHub account, which is basically anyone, right, is able to come in and submit an EIP, a proposal to make a change to the protocol. And they ideally, along with that proposal, right, they explain the rationale for that proposal. They include code samples for it. Ideally, they include things like tests. And if that proposal is well formed, technically, if it meets the basic requirements, it gets merged into the EIP repository on GitHub by one of the EIP editors. Yeah. People like Hudson and Nick Johnson who do a lot of this work. At that point, there's a review period, and it can move through several phases, and eventually it may reach an accepted state, which again doesn't mean that it will go into the protocol. It just means that it's sort of well-formed and technologically sound, and it's possible to implement, and maybe there's an actual working implementation in one of the major clients. And then maybe or maybe not, that EIP gets brought up on an all core devs call, right, which is this call that happens every 2 weeks. This is our I don't even know what to call it. It's our legislative body, so to speak, right? De facto, right? Because no one ever there's no constitution, right? So no one ever officially said the core devs are in charge, but it's kind of like a de facto thing. And if the EIP is brought up and debated on that call, and there is rough consensus, right? So not voting, just rough consensus. In other words, if at least one person champions it and no one objects too strongly to it, then it may be slated for inclusion into a future hard fork and make it into a future hard fork. That's kind of where the formal process ends. And then what happens after that is very informal, right? And that's just the way that any hard fork happens. All the different node operators, the exchanges, the miners, et cetera, would then need to download that update and install it. And if they don't do that, and we get past the fork block number, then we have a hard fork and we have two Ethereums. And so the reason I'm mentioning that is because there's always this escape mechanism. I think I called it a release valve or something, right? Where if, in a hypothetical extreme case where if the core devs were to become corrupt, or Vitalik or someone were to sneak in some EIP that minted a trillion new ether for themselves, no one has to actually download that software and run it. So there's this positive and negative aspect to governance, right? That's one of the themes I've been exploring. Positive in the sense that only the EIP authors and editors and core devs have the ability to enact changes in a positive fashion, but actually many parties have the ability to block changes by vetoing them.
Interesting. So you positive meaning that's okay. So can you reiterate what you mean?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's the idea, right? If you want to change the Ethereum protocol, there's a specific process that needs to be followed and a set of gates you need to get through. And it's actually, it's a decently long list of things. And it can be blocked at any of those stages, right? So if you write the EIP and you can't convince one of the EIP editors to merge it because on whatever grounds, that it's not sound technologically, it won't get merged and it's dead in the water, right? If it does get merged and it does get accepted, but you can't convince one of the core devs to champion it on one of the core dev calls, then it's blocked. All the way through, as I said, to the hard fork happening and then to some critical mass of the network actually downloading and running that new code. So many people have this veto power over it, but miners, for example, they don't unilaterally have the ability to make changes. They only have the ability to block changes.
Block changes, okay. So the community at least has a chance to block changes, but they don't really yet have a way to propose new changes.
Well, they do. I mean, anyone is welcome to propose changes through the EIP process, right? I'm just saying that the only group that has the power to actually make the change is the core developers. That's what I mean by technocracy, in the sense that they're the ones writing the code and they're the ones deciding on the canonical code base for their respective clients. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But how else would it be, right? It's not the developers are the only people who can make the change.
Well, so it could be the case that we have some authority, some higher authority than the developers, that the developers the core developers are accountable to. Right, and that could be any of the things I said. It could be in the case of Tezos is a great example, right? Tezos does everything on chain, and people who hold tokens vote. So in that case, the core developers are not the ultimate authority. The token holders are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, how is this different from what Vitalik describes as the multifactorial consensus for how he believes governance works, where he outlines? He kind of talks about, the EIP process, the consensus amongst the core developer teams, but he also outlines other stuff that the team does, which is Twitter polls, carbon votes, miner votes, the roadmap, user votes. Would you say all these are included in governance for Ethereum today? Or
I would say I agree with Vitalik on this. Multifactorial consensus is a cool name for it. I would say they all feed into the process we just described, and in particular to the core devs piece, right? Because the core devs, at least in theory, are responsible for taking the temperature of the community via all these different signaling mechanisms and channels and factoring that into the decisions they make. And in particular, people like Hudson do the bulk of this work. Not all the core devs are as hands-on with the community as Hudson is.
Got it. And how good do you think the community is at actually taking community input today?
How good is the community at taking community input? I'm not sure I understand that question.
The core devs.
Okay. I would say not so great. I think that's part of our problem, right? Because for a couple of reasons. I think one is that we just don't have very good signaling tools, right? So that list you just ran through, like all those things are relevant and significant and important, but it's very challenging to keep up with all those things. Again, like people like Hudson, like that's basically his job. I do this to a lesser extent than he does. But I think it's very challenging for the core devs because a lot of them, just to be clear, Hudson is like, I don't even know what to call Hudson. He's I call him like the root of trust in the Ethereum community. Like he's not writing code is what I'm saying, right? So the core devs are the ones off writing the code, and they want to just be core devs and write code, and they don't want to be politicians, right? Because in many ways, like what Hudson is doing, this whole like engaging with the community, there's like a political aspect to it. So that's part of our challenge.
So would you agree that, okay, so then I think like, do you think that a lot of this problem stems from the fact that Vitalik took a huge step back from the community because he didn't want to be seen as a leader, and so now there's no governing body to make these decisions?
So this gets very sort of philosophical in the like what's it called? Political philosophy sense of the word very quickly. Yeah. I will say two things. I'll say number one, I think he made the right decision because I think he recognized quite early on, to his credit, right, that if he did not sort of take that step back, that Ethereum would be overly reliant on him, and we have sort of too much key man risk. We have potentially too much centralization. And in that respect, it's actually having sort of one person calling the shots is, again, very counter to, I think, Ethereum's values and ethos, right, which is decentralization. So I think he made the right decision. But I also think that what you said is accurate, right? I think that in large part, like we were overly relying on him, and now we're in a situation where the parents are gone and there's sort of no adults in the room, and like we need to figure out how to govern ourselves, right? And that's exactly the growing pains that we're going through right now. Okay.
And like do you see any people emerging to kind of fill in that gap of like setting the values, setting the norms, like, or do you think people are kind of just lost? And that's what irked this tweet. Like, what made you tweet this thing?
Yeah. I think that we have very strong technological leadership. Right. I think people, first of all, I think people like Vitalik and Danny, Ryan, and all the people researching and developing Ethereum 2 are like awesome. We have all these great teams. I think that project has reasonably strong leadership. We're struggling a little more on the Ethereum 1 side, Ethereum 1X, right? So we have a gentleman named Alexei Akunov who has like come forward and really done an enormous amount of work. Again, on the technological side here, we have folks like Boris Mann, who have been doing the backbreaking work of the, coordinating. We have the Ethereum cat herders, which are doing project management. All of this is like amazing, but all of this is still technological, right? And what we're really lacking is the social leadership. And I'm using the term social here, like in the broadest possible sense of the word. So I think this is sort of what I've been struggling with. And I think this is what led to the tweets and just my work in general on governance. I think it's the realization that more and more of the challenges that Ethereum is facing and will face for a long time are social challenges.
Yeah.
Right. So there's so many examples of this. I'll just pick one. There's a new initiative, full disclosure, I'm part of this initiative, right, to get ecosystem funding in the form of like block rewards, which is kind of what Zcash does. I don't want to go into the details of it, but we have two EAPs in the works. That we just filed a new one, EIP 1890, I think just yesterday about this. But the point I want to make here, I'm not going to argue for or against it. The point I want to make is that this is not a technological question, right? I wrote the code. It's literally 5 lines of code. I don't think you can really dispute the code. It's a social question, right? It touches upon all these questions of political philosophy and of who's in charge and of who, which sort of classes of stakeholders should benefit at the expense of which classes of stakeholders, and what does fairness mean? And there's just all these social questions, right? And I don't think that, to your point in the very beginning, right, about needing like a shared, I call it a shared narrative, you can call it values or goals, right? I don't know that we have that as a community right now. And I think that we also don't have that social leadership, and that's where we're struggling, and that's what I'm frustrated about.
Yeah. And like, I think I truly believe it does come back to that. Like every time I look at this problem, I'm like people, for example, I'm building True Story, right? And like every day I talk to my team and we like if I just let my team go, they're not ever going to come to a consensus on a decision unless I define like the set of values and mission we're going after. And then
Yep.
based on that set of values, they can independently make a decision to know whether it fits that mission and values or
Right.
not. And if you're fundamentally missing that, this is kind of where this is what I believe at least. This is where you end up, where you're like no one knows what is the right decision to make. And so I think like why hasn't the community at least has the community maybe I'm missing this has the community tried to figure out what its shared narrative is?
A little bit. So first of all, just I want to say I agree, right? I've been a founder before, and like Startup 101, right, is like set a clear vision. There's this amazing quote, which I'm sure you've heard before, which is from a gentleman named, I think it's Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who's the author of The Little Prince, right? And he said, if you wish to build a ship, do not divide the men into teams and send them to the forest to cut wood. Instead, teach them to long for the vast and endless sea.
Yeah.
That's always been one of the most inspirational quotes to me as a founder. And I really believe if you want to get a community of people excited about something and behind something, like you need to set that vision for them. Someone, you, I, it has to emerge and exist in some fashion. And that is by definition a centralized fashion. So there has been some attempt to do this in Ethereum. The one that I'm aware of is an initiative called EIP0, which we kicked off exactly a year ago, right, at EdCon in Toronto with a group of shareholders and the stakeholders in the room, just generally to debate Ethereum governance in general, the social side of governance more than the technical. And of course, that was right in the wake of that same funds recovery issue, right? So that was a very salient question at that point in time. We spent hours like debating questions like, what is the Ethereum community? How do we know who they are? How do we measure sentiment? What are our shared values? And we really, 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 really struggled with it, right? Because it is a very diverse community and there's very little in the way of like values or goals that I think everybody shares. Like one that we can probably agree on, I think it was Nick Johnson who said this, right? Is like, let's keep adding blocks to the chain. No, I mean, I think that anyone who's like an Ethereum stakeholder will agree with that statement.
Yeah.
But can you say anything more specific than that? Like, can you say immutability? Or like, well, no, there's like big groups of stakeholders that would hate that, right? So it's very difficult to come to consensus on this now. It's one of those things about culture. Like it's easy in the beginning and like very hard to change later, if that makes sense.
So do you think the problem is that this wasn't defined early on, and so it's a little bit too late to define this for such a large community?
Well, that presupposes that there is a problem, right? And I think we're dancing around this, and like we have to talk about this as well. And this is something I'm struggling with. Like, assuming like you and I are saying that we do need this social leadership, then yes, I agree it's a problem and it should have been defined early on. But I think again, we are where we are today because it's by design, right? I think that key stakeholders early on, people like Vitalik, made the decision, I think actually consciously not to do that.
Okay.
For specific reasons.
And so the reasons are because he believes it leads to a more centralized system.
Yeah, so centralization is a little bit of a red herring. It's like one of those terms that people throw around without like really trying to define it. The framework that I find that helps me the most here is, oh boy. So this is like what Vlad has begun calling Szabo's law. I'm sure you probably saw, he posted this article a couple months ago now. There's been some back and forth on this, but like he really highlighted this really central question. And again, this also gets very philosophical very quickly, right? But the central question, which is that we have these like autonomous software systems like blockchains. And do we want to govern them? Or do we believe that they should be like as simple and minimal as possible without governance, right? So you have folks like Nick Szabo, like I don't like calling it Szabo's law because I don't think that Nick said this specifically, but what Nick Szabo has said, right, is that these systems are sort of these tools of social scalability, and therefore we need to keep them as socially, like, how do I put it? We want to minimize social trust on these systems. And so the moment you start opening them up to like governance, right? Vitalik put this another way recently. He was like, we don't want people to think that Ethereum is like this political thing that people can like reason with or negotiate with. Right. And the moment you have like leadership, it does become something that people negotiate with, and therefore it may reduce its utility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but Lane, like I think like if that is what Ethereum is trying to go for, then I think they have to just admit that progress isn't you don't make progress unless there's governance. Like you, right? Like, I mean,
Well,
for example, like Bitcoin, I think the Bitcoin ecosystem, I would argue, if they made a fundamental choice that they want to be an immutable ledger, digital gold.
yep,
They understand their narrative, and
yep,
so I would say their decisions are easy because if it doesn't fit that digital gold, immutable ledger narrative, then they do not make that
sure.
decision. So I don't know how how the community expects to make progress and
Yeah.
not
So
have values.
So the definition of Szabo's law, I'm going to paraphrase it here, is something, I know Vlad put this in his article, it's something like, we don't make any changes except those that are like technologically necessary for the network, right? So it's not that there's no change. It's just that like, we don't have a mechanism and we don't want a mechanism for dealing with the social stuff. Like we just do stuff that's like absolutely technologically critical for the network.
Okay.
So, and actually, like I had a little bit of conversation like on Twitter with Vitalik about this yesterday. Like the point I was making was that I actually believe that issues like Ethereum 1x and Ethereum 2 are like as social as they are technological. Like if we look at ETH 1x, which is this initiative to make the existing Ethereum chain more robust and reduce the size of the state or cap it rather, right, to keep it alive for some time, we're going to inevitably have to introduce things like, call it what you want to call it, storage management fees or state rent or something. And that's a very social thing, right? Like that impacts different groups of stakeholders in different ways. It causes issues for exchanges and things like this, issues of fairness. And so I contend actually that without a mechanism to sort of handle the social stuff, like kind of what you're saying, right? That like the big changes won't happen. And Vitalik kind of pushed back a little bit and says that he feels that like ETH 1x is sort of so unambiguously good for the network from a technological perspective that it will happen. But then we can still like I responded by saying like, well, what about things like this this block rewards funding for the ecosystem? I think that's very important, but that's not at all technical. It's social. And if we don't have a mechanism to deal with that, then we can't have any social good stuff. So again, we kind of go round and round in circles here. I do have a sort of solution that I'm beginning to work out, but I want to just stop there for a sec before I say more.
Okay, so I'm still trying to understand the issue because I think like I don't really understand. Like I almost feel like you're trying to have the cake and eat it too. Like I think you're gonna have to choose whether if you want to have a completely decentralized system where
Right.
there's no central body, there's no one making decisions, there's no quote unquote leader, then I think we just have to accept the fact that social coordination, like, yeah, I'm feeling like
we do, right? We that's what I keep calling a de facto technocracy. Like it's a lie to say that there's no centralized anything because we do. We have a group of like 20 to 30 people who get on a call every 2 weeks and make these decisions. Again, there's this whole like the protection in place, and I think that what makes this decentralized is the vetoes that I was describing, right? Like like the core devs can rule on something and people can choose to fork or not follow or not run the code or whatever. But like we do have a mechanism. It's just that mechanism is stuck.
So okay, so then one of the things that you said in your tweet storm was like if we go with this if we still continue to try to figure out the better decentralized approach, and in the meantime we just like succumb to a centralized governance for the time being. You said at the end you're like, we can do that, but we should try best to avoid capture. Can you explain what you mean by capture?
Yeah, this is like again, I get out of my depth pretty quickly on these like deep kind of game theory and political philosophy topics, but it is something that actually has begun to make sense to me recently. Like whenever you have a well-defined mechanism, a formalized governance mechanism, like it doesn't matter what it is. You can call it, one token holder, one vote. You can say it's core devs. You can say it's I don't know, we rule based on, the amount of code you've committed and merged on GitHub, like whatever metric you choose, those metrics are gameable and capturable, right? Like let's say for the sake of argument that we were to formalize Ethereum governance and say we give each of the core devs, arbitrarily, I'm going to say there's 100 core devs, and someone, again, for the sake of argument, let's say Vitalik mints 100 of these governance tokens and hands them out to the 100 core devs, right? It's very like a lot of people propose these ideas all the time. Like if you look at the responses to my threads, and I also want to be clear, like I think there's a lot of value in experimenting with these things, but not in a binding fashion, right? Like let's use them as signals, right? As inputs. The problem is once you formalize governance and you have this formalized rule set, right? So now we're like surrendering ourselves to these 100 token holders. All sorts of like crazy things will start happening, right? Ethereum network today, it's worth about $10 billion, $11 billion, okay? And it could very well be worth $100 billion or even $1 trillion in the future. Well, guess what? If you have a token that gives you 1/100th of control over a network worth $100 billion, what is that token worth? Something like $1 billion, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, someone could come up to a core dev and say, here is $99 billion, right? Yeah. Sorry, here's $999 million, right? Let me buy your token.
Yeah.
And they can go around to all the core devs and buy all the tokens and control the network. And I think they'd probably have to pay a lot less than $999 million. You see what I'm getting at here? Like any system you come up with, right? We can play this game theory game all day. I can give you a way to capture that system.
Yeah.
And that's why we're terrified of, I think, formalizing governance.
So, okay. I 100% agree with you there. And then you mentioned that you're coming to a proposed solution or potential solution. What's going through your head now? Like, what next? Yeah, so solution is too strong of a word. I would say, I don't know, mitigation or just kind of like, you know, suggestions for the path forward. I think it's very rare that like humans find solutions to things. I think we kind of tend to muddle through them, you know, and like, I kind of think like it's a little frustrating, but it was probably pretty clear if you read my tweet storm, like that as unappetizing as all those options are, like truly like 1 through 4, like Ethereum's failed. Like I would quit tomorrow if we were to fall back on one of those options. So 5 sucks, but like it's the best we've got. And so I think that sort of falling back for now on centralized governance is our only option. Yeah. This goes back very strongly to that great, I think it's a Churchill quote, right, where he said like democracy is the worst possible system of government except for all the others that have been tried. Like I would say the same thing of like centralization, like it sucks, but like it's really all we've got right now. And so the way that I reconciled these two camps, right, there's this like Szabo's law camp, which is like, oh, like we want full autonomy. We don't want any law on the blockchain. And then there's like what Vlad is kind of arguing for now, which is like some kind of crypto law and saying like, actually, we do want governance. I think we need to consider time. Like, I think that it is possible, and I hinted at this in my tweet as well, that like 10 years from now or 100 years from now, we figure out how to have these autonomous systems that like really are autonomous and can govern themselves in some sort of socially minimized way. But like, I just don't think we're anywhere close to that yet. And so the direction I'm leaning is like, let's stick with this shitty, you know, centralized like governance that we have. Let's do it way better than we are, right? So this comes back to things like transparency and accountability, which I think we need way, like just heaps more of in Ethereum today. And let's own that fact that like this is a work in progress, and let's have a roadmap to get there. And this is again the thing that frustrates me. I've never seen anyone in the Ethereum community like give me a roadmap for how we get there. Yeah, and I think like I generally hate the terms decentralized and centralized.
Exactly.
Because like centralization for the sake of centralization or decentralization for the sake of decentralization is just a useless argument.
Great.
Like, okay, let's say we do go with this centralized governance approach, so, right? Like, I think we can all agree of what we're trying to avoid with centralization and build tools to avoid those bad factors of centralization. And centralization doesn't have to be bad if you can try to at least avoid the factors of it that make it bad.
I mean, I agree with you, but I think it's a little bit of a naive approach. And like, again, I just want to reiterate, like the entire, like for me, obviously Ethereum means different things to different people, right? But for me, essentially Ethereum is about building better institutions. Like that's it. Yeah. That's the only reason I'm on Ethereum instead of Bitcoin or ... right? And so it's like, it's about dog fooding, right? It's like, if you're a company that builds, I don't know, like automobiles, right? There's this whole quote about like, you know, you're at Chevrolet, you drive the company car, right? And you're building automobiles, and like your automobile, like you don't have an automobile that's like mature enough to drive yet. So everyone is driving like Hondas. That's a problem, right? Like it's hypocritical in a way, right? So it's sad, right? It's disappointing. It's frustrating. It may be the reality. It probably is the reality of where we're at today. But there's the naivety piece as well. And this goes back to like this risk of capture. Like, I don't want to get hung up on this too much. But look, there's a lot of foundations in crypto, like dozens of them. And most of them are pretty crappy, right? Like in almost every case, they end up in this crappy situation where you have like a small number of people pulling the strings, right? And it's like not transparent and not accountable.
Yep.
And And I think that's a form of capture, right? And so this is the challenge I'm facing. Like, sure, we can spin up another foundation, we can spin up some other centralized entity, but like, it's just like the absolute most extreme example of hubris to be able to say, like, everyone else got it wrong, I'm going to do it better this time, without some mechanism to do that. Do you see where I'm getting here? Like, this is what's so frustrating.
So basically, I think you're saying that, like, okay, then the transparency and accountability seem to be the biggest, best ways to make sure that we don't end up in this capture situation.
It's the best tools we've got, right? They're not perfect. That's what I'm trying to say, but it's the best tools we've got. Yes.
Okay, so then, like, what are ways that we can bring more transparency and accountability into the governance today? Do you have any ideas?
I'm trying to think of a way to answer your question that doesn't involve the Ethereum Foundation, because I actually think that it's a little bit of a red herring here.
Yeah.
Because, like, you could say what you will about EF. I obviously have my opinions about it. It's not blocking anything, in the sense that like maybe EF is not as like effective as it could be or should be, but it's not actively, like, you know, trying to stop Ethereum governance from happening, right? So like, we have a clear path for us to like come together as a community and like do what we need to do. And I think EF has a role to play in that. I think a lot of other organizations, existing organizations and projects and teams have a role to play in that. I think that the cat herders, an initiative I helped get start quite recently with Hudson and a few other people, like, is one approach, right? So the cat herders is like a group of professional project managers who jump on these calls, on the all core devs calls, get involved in governance and project management, like lend their expertise. And they're like I couldn't imagine a more transparent organization. Like, every call is recorded and live streamed and broadcast. There's like 5 or 6 different channels where the community can communicate with the cat herders. All the funding, 100% of it is on chain in a multi-sig. We have this whole accountability process in place on GitHub, where like literally, right? To drive home this point to you, I did a transfer for 3 DAI the other day. That's roughly $3 US, right? And like, that went through like 2 approvals. And that may sound absurd, but like, I'm sorry, when you're dealing with like public money, that's the degree of accountability and transparency you should have. I think the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians was also set up in response to this perception of like lack of transparency in the community. And so I think like FEM is a great example, right? There's these events that anyone can participate in. Again, everything is like recorded and made public. You can participate remotely. All this is well and good, but it's still not enough. And I think we need way more.
And like, okay, so I'm still struggling, because I think, like, for example, people like Hudson play an immense role in the ecosystem. And if we had like 10 more Hudsons, like, a lot of this would be kind of solved, to be honest, because he kind of is doing all the social signaling, like gathering all the social signals that we want to be done. But like, then does that lead? Then like, we come back to the question of okay, if we're relying on 10 Hudsons, then is that too centralized? Like, I think we're just going back and forth here, and I think in the end, we have to decide whether we want to just be completely decentralized and just let teams independently make decisions and consider that just the state of affairs, or whether we want to clean it up by having a set of people, which I'm going to call leadership or coordinators or whatever, who are kind of defining the guiding light for the community.
Yeah.
I just see, like, you either have to pick that or that, and I don't see any other way forward.
So funny you mentioned 10 Hudsons. That is exactly our intention with the cat herders, is like getting as close as we can to cloning Hudson, and it's helped a lot. So I do think that like that has helped and will continue to help, and there will be more of these initiatives. But to answer your question, I think that centralization, decentralization is a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Right. I very firmly reject this idea that like we need to have one or the other, and there's multiple reasons for that. One is that they're multidimensional.
Yeah.
Right. Vitalik has a post from, I believe, like early last year or something, where he says something like the true meaning of decentralization. And he talks about like things like logical decentralization, like decentralization of where the data is stored versus decentralization of how the decisions are made. Right. So it's just like, it's a mistake to think about it as one dimensional. And as with almost all things in the world, right, like usually you want to have, there's some happy medium in between, right? So there are certain things where I think we do need centralized coordination. And like personally, there's like 2 or 3, right? So one is like direction, right? Like we need someone or somebody, some group to stand up and wave a flag and, make people yearn for the sea, right? And just like make it very clear, like what this project stands for and why we're all doing this. And again, you could push back. Like some people will say there is no singular vision, and that's fine, right? But I see this on my own team, right? I see that my own team struggles, I think, because we don't have this clear vision that we're working towards. Like we try to understand, okay, EWASM is cool, but like, where does it fit in to ETH1X? Where does it fit into ETH2? And all this stems from this central vision. So there's that. Yeah. I think coordination of funding is a big thing. I'll come back to this again and again. Like I really think that there's a great need for this ecosystem funding. So EF does a lot of this. Other organizations like Aragon and Status and Web3 Foundation, and there's no way I'm going to be able to list all of them, right? There's a lot of other like funds out there that help, but I think they're all quite limited in what they can do in both the actual amount of dollars and ether they can distribute, as well as their bandwidth for processing applications, right? So like I think we need more of that. And the moment you start collecting funding, like it literally is not possible to do this in a decentralized way. Like there has to be some first mover mechanism that like takes those funds and distributes them to people.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Even if all it does is it's like one line of code that says, here's 10 DAOs and we're going to give 1/10 to each of the 10 DAOs, like that's fine, but that's still centralized, right? So there has to be this first centralized like mover. And so governing that is the big thing. That, by the way, that's what kickstarted this whole like trip down the governance rabbit hole for me like a week ago, is trying to answer that particular question.
Of how to distribute the funds.
Yes. Yeah, because it was like we were going in circles, right? We're like, okay, we could set up a foundation to do it. Great. But like, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Can you take a step back and set the context for what this fund distribution was for?
So this is an initiative that I began working on with a couple of people, including a gentleman named Greg on the ChainSafe team and Kevin Owaki, the founder of Gitcoin, about a month ago. And the three of us kind of found each other and like realized that we had all independently been working on a similar thing, motivated by a similar desire to see the Ethereum ecosystem become, here we go again, less centralized, less reliant on the Ethereum Foundation, right, as like the main source of funding and leadership and direction. And I really like the idea of like anti-fragile, like less fragile, because God forbid something were to happen to EF or any of these other organizations or Ether tanks or whatever it might be, right? We need like other ways to keep the ecosystem going. So we came around in this initiative, and it's to support all the public good in Ethereum, all the things that are not being supported privately, basically.
Got it. Okay. And then there was like a lot of contention about how to actually distribute the funds, and then
yeah, I mean, again, technically this is easy. Like we literally filed an EAP. It's literally 5 lines of code, right? It's the governance. And the reason I firmly believe the reason this hasn't happened is because that governance is very hard. And I believe that if we have I was going to say solve. Again, solve is a very strong word. But if we have like a reasonable plan in place in the governance, I think it will happen.
Yeah. So, okay. Like, I mean, now that you kind of are explaining this to me, like I see where you're coming from when you say like, okay, core devs don't want to make these decisions. Right. They kind of just want to code, which is fair. Like developers don't want to be in political battles.
Right.
And so what we really need is some group of people or a governing body or something that is good at helping set that path and like guiding those decisions so that everyone can just like
if nothing else, let's say just making the core developers' lives as easy as possible, right? Let's say like literally just making it so they can just write code. Like who does that?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. And do you think this is one of the reasons why progress on like ETH 1.x and 2.x is slower than intended? Like, is it that the code is taking long to write, or is it that the decisions around the code are taking a long time to make?
I think it's the latter, the decisions. I really strongly believe that Ethereum, this community is overflowing with technical talent. I see this on my team. I see this on the other teams I work with. But I think that we just don't have the social leadership, and we don't have those visions, and we don't have great coordination.
Okay. So what do you think are next steps for this? Like how would, if you could wave a magic wand and like solve this problem, like, or okay, maybe not even, you don't know how to solve the problem, right? Like if you can wave a magic wand and see like, what is it, how do you want the community to, I guess like, what am I even asking? What is the problem that you really want solved? So it looks like the problem you want solved is you want core devs' lives to be easier. because you're seeing that they're getting frustrated and they don't want to make these decisions. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the highest level, if I had to put it in a single sentence, I would say I want to see Ethereum realize its full potential as, I call it, the operating system for building better human institutions. I want to see it become a platform. So I want to change the dialogue from governance of the blockchain to governance by the blockchain, right? I want to get to a place where we can use Ethereum to govern real world human institutions. That could be anything, right? It could be money like Maker. It could be courts systems like Claros or Aragon is building one. It could be organizations. It could be any of these things. And the point I'm making is that until Ethereum itself is like scalable, right? Yeah. We need ETH2, right? Yeah, I would say until it's mature and scalable and sustainable, we can't have those things. So how do we get Ethereum to that place? That's the high goal. And I think, yeah, one way to frame that in a simplistic way is like to reduce it is to say, how do we make the core devs' lives easier and allow them to just get back to work?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to open it up to the audience for Q&A, and I'm going to scroll through a bunch that came through. But yeah, in the meantime, anyone who's listening can send me questions, and I'll go through them one by one. Let's see. Let's see. Sorry. What about one guy said one wallet, one vote? Why not just do that?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, this is sort of like a suggestion of democracy.
Yep.
Right? Like kind of one whatever, one account, one vote, one person, one vote. And that like would be nice. The reason we don't have that and can't have that is because we have no way to formally prove that a person is like a human and not a robot, and that they're a unique person, right? So we call this like proof of unique personhood. And the specific case of one wallet, one vote, if I have like 10 Ether in my wallet, I can split that up into 10 wallets and get 10 votes, right? So that's why that doesn't work.
So the identity is the biggest. We don't have until identity is solved, we can't really have the one vote, one wallet.
There's a lot of things we can't have without identity. So I want to mention Glenn Weil here because I respect his work. I'm a big fan of his work. There was this big Radical Exchange conference that happened last week that he and his organization hosted. And Glenn has a line, which is that as long as blockchain formalizes property, right, and doesn't formalize notions of identity, then it's going to always be anti-democratic and plutocratic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where we are today, and that's real, and that also partly inspired my tweet storm, right? Like we just can't have democracy or anything even like democracy. Like you can't even have like one project, one vote, or one coder, one developer, one vote either.
Yeah, so I think and then you mentioned like technocracy. I actually don't even think technocracy is a bad thing if the people actually want to make decisions, but it looks like in this case the developers don't really want to be making those decisions even if they can. So really maybe what it comes down to is that like Ethereum has a really, really big, amazing community. And so people who are passionate about the project should probably step up and contribute to this problem and maybe help make these decisions. I don't really know. Like I don't.
No, you're 100% right, and that is happening, right? Like that's definitely happening, and that's what gives me hope, right? That is what the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians, like literally, that's why it was created. That's what it exists to do, is to give people a voice in governance. But the thing is this, that the Fellowship is about technical governance, and it still doesn't address the social governance questions. So do we need like a social governance initiative? 100%, right? We have this thing called EIP 0. We've only had one event so far. I think a very likely outcome of this for me is that I'm going to commit to spearheading a new social governance initiative that, like, obviously it's one of those things, like it can't be about me, right? It's about the community coming together and like having their voices be heard.
So are there projects that do this well, the social leadership?
I don't know of any.
Okay.
I don't know of any project that's better governed than Ethereum. I'm also not like, I don't know. I genuinely, I'll be upfront about what I don't know. Like I struggle to keep up with Ethereum. There's no way I can keep up with other projects. I know that projects like Dash and Decred in particular have very, very interesting models involving some degree of social coordination. Like Dash, for example, has a website where you can go to see every time the core developers request funding. It's transparent, right? You can see where the money's being spent. There's a specific proposal for it. There's voting. So again, like we don't have voting, right? So like that makes things like that hard in Ethereum. There's a lot of ideas floating around, but any project that tells you today that they've like solved governance,
lying.
They're lying.
Yeah.
I want to say one quick thing, which is you said like technocracy is not that bad. I actually think technocracy is pretty terrible.
Why?
I think it may be, again, like the best we can do in the short term. The reason is because I have a blog post about this from last year. I think it's in that How Open is Too Open blog post. But the problem is like Ethereum should be a platform, in my perspective, for all human beings to build on top of and transact and to build future societies and institutions on. And like, do you really think that a group of 25 or 50, like let's just call a spade, right? Like almost all these people are men, right? There's like one or two women who sometimes join the conversation. Pretty much all of them are wealthy and educated and Western. Do you really think that these people can build a system for all of humanity? I mean, some people will say yes, and they'll say diversity is bullshit, and they'll say we're building base layer protocols like TCP/IP, and you can build anything you want on top of it. But I reject that in the strongest terms because the reality is we're not. We're building things like staking, which are very social. And the moment social stuff comes into it, we need more voices.
But like, if you think about, I'm just making a parallel to other open source projects, whether that's like Linux or other projects like that. Like, a lot of them have very few people. It's kind of a similar dynamic where there's very few core developers who are doing all the bulk of the work. So how is this any different?
I just think Ethereum is more ambitious. I think Ethereum can be a lot more than Linux. I think it's a great example, by the way. Like Linux has become something awesome, and you're right. As far as I know, it is very, very centralized governance. Like until very recently, Linus was like the king of Linux.
Yeah.
But I think Ethereum is trying to do a lot more. It's way more ambitious, and again, it's social, right? Money, even just money. Like forget all the other stuff. Like money is already a social thing. Linux doesn't have money. Linux doesn't have social code baked into it the way Ethereum does. To me, that's the difference.
I'm not sure I completely buy that because, I mean, the decisions Linux make, even though Linux might not have money baked into it, the decisions they make, like a lot of people use Linux. So the decisions they make do affect like a large.
So we can always have this like layer one, layer two distinction, right? This applies equally to Ethereum and blockchain as it does to Linux, right? So in Linux, layer one is the Linux operating system. And layer two is all like, actually layer one is like the kernel of the operating system, right? And then there's all this stuff you can build on top of it. And the kernel is very simple, right? And you can do anything with it. In Ethereum, I think our like quote unquote kernel, our layer one is significantly more complex. And again, I really feel quite deeply that things like staking are very social at their nature. So it's not, I mean, maybe I'm overreacting and exaggerating. Like maybe it can be done in a relatively like simple, unbiased way, but like, I'm just like, I believe the history of the world and the history of human society and even the history of technology suggests otherwise. And we should like learn from those things.
Okay. A question that came in from Dan Zuller was, can the election of identified decision makers harm the network from a regulatory perspective? Is that a concern for you?
Can you read that again? Was it decentralized decision makers?
Can the election of identified decision makers harm the network from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, 100%. This is like one of our biggest concerns. So I mentioned this in my tweet storm as well, which is that there are multiple reasons the core developers today do not want to make decisions on social things.
Yeah.
And one of those is legal liability. I think this is a challenge for EF. I think it's a challenge for any organization where the people in charge are identified, right? Because they open themselves up for liability. Anyone in any jurisdiction can come attack them and say, you know, my funds got locked. It's your fault because it's your protocol. And so I think this is one of the big things we need to solve as well.
That's a really valid concern. In that case, I can totally see why core devs don't want to get into these decisions at all.
Oh, it's you ain't seen nothing yet. This is like, we have one core developer, a gentleman named Yoichi Hirai, who stepped down last year because of this. It's been a concern. So we lost Afri Shedin this year. And that was not so much about regulation as more about just community, but it's related. You know, Hudson has come under pressure recently. If we don't have protections in place, just social protections, including legal protections for core developers, this is not going to work.
Yeah. And I think like this brings me back to like Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is probably the only system that kind of lucked out with the anonymous leader or founder. And I don't think any other system can have the same dynamic. And so you always end up being able to point back to a central group of people who are or did make the early decisions.
So Grin is trying to do this today, right? So that's going to be
Yeah.
interesting because they have an anonymous or pseudonymous founder. In the case of Ethereum, I actually think that question, this question of liability, culpability, the SEC investigation over whether Ethereum's a security. Again, I'm not a lawyer, right? I think that's a big cause of the challenges we're facing, because I think that those folks, those founders and Ethereum Foundation people, have had no choice but to not make those decisions themselves, right? So they can say, it's not us, it's happening in a decentralized fashion. I think those concerns are largely behind us today, but the suggestions I've heard are that they're not completely a thing of the past, and they may never be. And so I just want to be clear, like that is absolutely a big challenge.
Yeah. And one of the questions that came in was like, how is staking social?
Well, how is staking social? If you want to sell your stake, how do you do that?
How would I do that?
Yeah, I mean, you need to find someone to sell it to, right? That's like a social thing. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't want to pretend I haven't thought through this like super thoroughly, but I do believe like voting is sort of a social thing, right? You're like, what the validators are really doing is they're voting on what they believe to be like the canonical state of Ethereum, in a way that like the miners and proof of work are not so much, because that's more objective. It's more like, like I prove to you that I've like done this calculation, this amount of work. I think staking is a bit more social. Yeah, I'd love to circle back on that. Like, that's a great question.
Yeah, and I think like interesting. Like, you actually opened up my perspective a little bit on this. Like, now, for a long time, I was like, okay, why aren't just a group of people stepping up and making the decisions? But the regulatory thing actually is a very interesting thing to get into, and I'm sure that's probably on top of people's minds. And also, like, unless like maybe one approach is like we actually request the community, like we send them out a request and be like, hey, like we're looking for social coordination help. Has that ever been done before, where we like we like literally go out and say that? Or is this like, are we just expecting someone to come in and govern and serve as the governing body?
That's how the cat herders were born.
Okay.
Literally, we were on stage at a Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians event. So there you go, right? One initiative leading to another in Prague around DevCon last year. And we got up on stage and said, hey, we need help with project management. Are there any project managers in the room? Like, as an offhanded thing at the end of an event. And we had like 24 people who reached out and offered to help.
Okay.
And so I mean, project management is social, right? So we have done it. We need to do it more. But back to that liability question, like folks like Alexei, right? Again, I think very highly of Alexei. He's sort of emerged as this like de facto leader of the Ethereum 1x project from the technical side. He has said in no uncertain terms, like, I do not want this responsibility. I don't want the social leadership role because I live in a certain jurisdiction and I'm concerned about liability questions. So we can't overemphasize how big that question is.
That's a big one. And I mean, I don't have an answer for that either. I actually didn't think about that angle from a community perspective, because I can totally see that concern, like especially because a lot of the regulatory stuff is so up in the air right now and no one has an answer for what is what.
It's even worse because, like, if we were to say, oh, like, you and I are both in the United States and, this is an American project, whatever, right? But it's not. It's so complex and multidimensional because it's global. Like, we need to wait for this body of law and precedent to emerge in like 100 jurisdictions before we can do anything. And we can't just all go hide in Malta or whatever. Like, actually, that is, by the way, that is like that is the Pirate Bay approach. Do you know what Pirate Bay is, right? It's this torrent, this BitTorrent site that's existed for like, it has been shut down and moved and reopened like a cockroach, like dozens of times. It's absolutely fascinating. And they just keep changing jurisdictions and doing what I call regulatory arbitrage. That's like one approach, is we find 10 people and we put them in Malta or wherever the most favorable jurisdiction is, and we create a foundation and we say, this is Ethereum, but that's very centralized because now the Maltese government can capture it. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's just so complicated and such a hard problem.
Has there ever been I'm trying to think of, besides Bitcoin, can you think of any other example where there isn't a governing body? A project, any kind of project in the past?
The two examples I usually use of sort of decentralized big pieces of infrastructure being built are Linux and the internet. And actually, I think the internet's a better example. The internet was not built in a centralized fashion.
How would you
It
define
started.
Like who? Not how would you define like who?
The series of tubes by which all of our computers pass TCP/IP packets around.
Isn't that like a whole host of protocols?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. There was no centralized coordination in the internet. That's the best example.
Okay. That's
in
fair.
the beginning. No, there was in the beginning, right? So it was started as a DARPA project. It was funded by the government. It started out as like, 10 universities back in like the 60s or 70s. But it grew very quickly. And there are standards bodies like the IETF and the W3C that have emerged. But I also want to make a point here, which is that the internet was captured by big companies. And that didn't turn out so well. So I kind of want to avoid that for Ethereum if possible.
Okay, fair point.
I think the internet was great in the 90s. I think that, all these standards like HTML and SMTP emerged from these decentralized sort of grassroots bodies like IETF and W3C. But what we've seen in the past 2 decades is that Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Google and Microsoft and Alibaba have taken over the internet and re-centralized it around things like identity. So that's the risk that we face in Ethereum as well, is capture. That's capture, by the way. That's the definition of capture.
Capture. But I think if you're kind of building any kind of network, the power law, it always leads to at some stage that ends up happening. I don't see how you avoid that.
Well, I guess I would just say that if there aren't, you may be right, and it may be one of those unalienable laws of the internet, of the universe that we can't escape. But I guess what the Szabo's law camp would say is that if there aren't those structures in the first place, then there is nothing to be captured. And yeah, fine, businesses will emerge, right? And no one's saying that people shouldn't build big centralized businesses on Ethereum. It's more that the base layer infrastructure can't be captured and is still there and is still like a public resource that anyone at any time can use. And in the case of the internet, even that, so I would say it to a large extent is not free. It's quite complex, right? Partly because there's 3 companies that control all the actual internet hardware and the routers and stuff. Partly because we now have net neutrality is dying in the States. So yeah, the internet has issues as well.
Awesome, Lane. It's reaching an hour, so I'm going to end it here. And I think it'd be awesome to continue the conversation. And I'd love to coordinate anything that I can be useful to coordinating. I think these kind of discussions are super important because one, the Ethereum community is global, and sometimes these decisions take weeks or months or years to make. But I think I don't know if it's because there's a lack of a efficient format to do these or what it is. But I think the more of these conversations that we can have, the better, so we can actually make decisions. But if we can be helpful anyway, let us know. But I'll let the people who are watching ask any follow-up questions in the Twitter thread that I'll share. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Preeti. See you on Crypto Twitter. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. And I think this is a very important topic, so I'll keep working on it. And I look forward to hearing everyone else's input as well.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing your insights.
Thanks.